Red Dead Redemption is overrated. It was very hard for me to admit that to you, let alone myself. Red Dead Redemption is considered a masterpiece of the 7th generation of consoles, and I was eager to play it when the second game was getting a lot of buzz. I got a backwards compatible copy for the Xbox One, and I shoved it in, and I was a tad underwhelmed. I couldn't exactly see what made this such a revered game when it came out, at least to the extent it was. I thought it was good, not great, and certainly no masterpiece. Red Dead Redemption 2 I preferred instantly. I feel the prequel had the more interesting story, characters, and gameplay. Obviously the prequel had a massive advantage over the first game, but the first game certainly utilized the technology in its own generation. For me, the problems in Red Dead Redemption mostly relate to a lot of aspects of the first third of the game in terms of the story. A story that wasn't as satisfying as I'd like, and a dozen dull missions I didn't enjoy. Today, we'll look at 2010's Red Dead Redemption and give my brutally honest review of the game and why I think it's overrated. Please tell me I'm missing something, because I wasn't as engaged as other people said they were. Red Dead Redemption was created as a spiritual successor to Red Dead Revolver, and as such, takes place in its own canon. Red Dead Redemption was developed by Rockstar San Diego, who are mostly known for Red Dead Redemption, and afterwards was a studio that contributed to both Grand Theft Auto 5 and Red Dead Redemption 2. Although every other studio contributed equally to those products, it seems Rockstar Games' strategy is to get all the studios to work on one project every generation at this point. Grand Theft Auto 6 is next, given the leaks exposed by the hacker. Anyways, Red Dead Redemption is set in the Wild West, the Dying West. As the writers decided to make a story set in the transitional period for the United States going into the modern era. The game is primarily set in 1911, and has slightly more advanced technology than any other Wild West games. To be honest, there isn't a lot of Western games, especially in the AAA landscape. I suppose both Red Dead Redemption games set a high bar. Red Dead Redemption was released on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 with no PC port to this day. It would be nice to have, but according to the developers, it's a miracle it works on console. Red Dead Redemption, after I completed it, almost felt like an experiment that went well, but not too well. Many have said that it's Grand Theft Auto in the Wild West, and I partially agree with that. It's not a bad thing, and it means that it has the same fun as Grand Theft Auto, gameplay-wise at least. In my opinion, Grand Theft Auto 4 told the best story in the series, and that was extremely impressive. It was filled with unique and memorable characters and a compelling story that was a huge step up, especially since DLCs expanded on the story and made it even more intricate. The story was fully fleshed out from the start. Red Dead Redemption, I feel, didn't quite live up to the standards set by GTA 4. I want to summarize the entire game and discuss why I think it's overrated and why it is a good game, but I think it's got a higher rap. I'm either missing something, or people always regard Rockstar Games as masterpieces, especially the HD open world games. The start to this game is okay. It starts with a ferry landing in the town of Blackwater, with our protagonist John Marston walking with two federal agents before he gets on a train. The whole opening cutscene is just of John sitting there while other people on the train talk. I suppose it's world building, but it felt to me like an exposition dump of this is the state of the Wild West, as multiple characters speak. And I have to say that GTA 4's intro was much better. It showed rather than told. The exposition in this game didn't make for that interesting dialogue. Getting off the train, we walk into Armadillo, one of the game's main towns, and we meet a contact, in which we are meant to ride horses with them. I have to say that the horses control great, plus the stamina bar is simple and effective. It's a good balancing act between keeping your horse moving and saving energy. Our contact is obviously here to take us somewhere, that being Fort Mercer. The dialogue here is pretty simple. John alludes to what's going on, but it's not fully revealed here. John so far seems to be a quiet, reserved protagonist. To describe John, he's a man who's reluctantly dedicated to do a task and is quick to anger. I feel John wasn't as fleshed out as he could have been. The story as it's presented has this sort of reserved feeling, and what I mean by that is that it doesn't really care about telling a grand, intricate story. Instead, it's a story that's mostly in depth, but mostly by observing things like what characters say and how they say it and whatnot. The direct story for most of the game isn't that interesting. Like, for example, after making it to Fort Mercer, John calls out for a man called Bill Williamson. Bill comes out, recognizing John and vice versa. They allude to some past history, and John implores Bill to give himself up, and what happens? John tries pulling out his gun and one of Bill's goons shoots him. What a short game. I'm just kidding. John survives, as he's rescued by some strangers as he's bleeding out from outside the fort. When John wakes up, he's greeted by a woman named Bonnie McFarlane, a decent supporting character. Side note, all of the supporting characters are decent at best. Bonnie McFarlane points out how stupid John was, and that he needs to work to pay off the medical bill. So John made the choice for us, having him nearly throw his life away, but story-wise, it leaves us with a lot of work to do, before we can approach Fort Mercer again. And this I didn't like. Basically, the story progression only passes once we get to Fort Mercer prepared, and that takes a long while. It kind of feels like the game takes a massive detour with stuff that feels like side quests. Hell, the actual side quests have more intrigue to them than the first third of this game. So to describe the game in its early stages, it's dull. Riding around on a horse and taking a tour around the McFarlane Ranch feels hollow and uninteresting. I know this is a tutorial section, but the Grand Theft Auto games had more interesting set pieces for this sort of stuff. There's not much to say here. Immediately after, you're given a weapon, a rifle, and you basically go on a night watch job, where you are introduced to Deadeye, a useful game mechanic. Deadeye in all its forms slows down time and allows you to pick more targets more easily. There's 3 levels. The first level has specific targeting and non-feature. You need level 2 to get that. And level 3 to specifically choose. This night watch is needed to progress the story. But afterwards, night watches as a side activity is a paying job. And it pays decently at that. Due to inflation, $100 means a lot more in the Wild West than it does today. Just wanted to point that out. The third mission consists of racing Bonnie across the area, and it feels like a waste of time, and it doesn't progress the plot at all. Now with this game, I haven't talked much about the cutscenes, and that's because a lot of them merely feel like additional context. Like John mentioning he has a wife, and alludes to more stuff that he doesn't talk about directly. It gets quite tiresome on the first playthrough, because I wish John Marston would just talk about what's going on and why. We don't have a lot to go off of. Those federal agents so far have barely been mentioned. John's family has barely been mentioned, and John's past has barely been mentioned. It got kind of frustrating that the game started drip-feeding information at a slow-ass pace. It made for a questionable game experience. You can easily power through this game, but it wasn't as fun as I expected. Anyways, the game picks up around the time you start talking to Marshall Johnson. This is why I wish the game started off with something more like this. John approaching Fort Mercer, getting shot, and resulting you to go back to square one, and having to pay off a medical bill, and acquiring help for the assault on Fort Mercer, wasn't the best way to start the game. So along his quest to find his outlaw buddies, John will meet a bunch of characters that vary in personality. Marshall Johnson and Bonnie McFarlane are fairly normal people. Their likability stems from helping John out. But then we've got more bizarre characters like Seth and Nigel West Dickens, one being an unsanitary grave robber and the other a scam artist. Kinda like me. But I have to say that compared to other Rockstar games, the story feels a bit disconnected. Like, what I mean by that is that the protagonists and surrounding characters don't connect to each other that much. It's mostly just interactions between John and the supporting characters. I think this is why I prefer Red Dead Redemption 2. It feels like a more grounded and real experience, where all the gang members have specific relationships with each other, and it's a more interweaving connected story with a lot of depth. Here, not so much. I always felt like there was something off about this game the first time I played it, but I could never put my finger on what. It just doesn't work as well as the second game. I can kind of see why they made a prequel, because it gives this game far more context and stakes. Since I played this game before the sequel prequel, I just had this off feeling the whole time. The most enjoyable thing in this game are the straight-on-land gunfights. Every time I get enjoyment out of it, but I also have to say that I prefer the follow-up in that regard. When I was playing Red Dead Redemption, I kept wondering to myself whenever I was doing a mission for Nigel West Dickens or Seth Briers or Irish on why the hell I was doing this, and how it's relevant to the overall story. Red Dead Redemption felt like it was the kind of story where characters just say things and you piece together the backstory. I couldn't quite see the point of certain characters. The only thing that seems to happen is John Marston talking to a wacky character, and we get some humor out of it. Not much that advances a subplot, or the main story even. Like, how to describe my experience with the story is John Marston failing to capture Bill Williamson and getting shot, and then doing the slow gradual process of gathering allies for the raid on Fort Mercer, where he resides, but then when we actually get around to it, we find out he's in Mexico. And so our hard work getting into Fort Mercer was all for naught. Seriously, I was incredibly close to groaning when I heard that. I just worked my ass off to get into Fort Mercer, but now I have to travel to fucking Mexico just to go get Bill? What a rip-off. Someone tell me I'm not alone in thinking this. Well, anyways, we get to Mexico after traveling across the border, insert Trump joke here, and I will say the backdrop sort of improves from what we did so far. That's because we're in the middle of a high-stakes conflict, the Mexican Revolution. I do like how John doesn't give two shits and ends up aiding both sides in order to get himself closer to Bill. By then you've learnt level 3 Deadeye and picked up some more powerful weapons, but there isn't really a feeling on moving on with the story, if that makes sense. That's probably the big takeaway. The story is rather lacking in how it's presented. Doing missions for the Mexican army and then the rebels, I suppose, was a good way of showing the struggle between both sides. I have to ask though, wouldn't it have been a better idea to choose a side in the conflict to get to Bill Williamson? Because something I also noticed is how the honor system doesn't do much for the story. Oh sure, the strange man will make remarks based on your honor level, but aside from that, it doesn't really matter. John doesn't change persona. He's mostly stoic when he performs actions, good or bad. Also, unlike Grand Theft Auto 4, the choices you make do not matter at all. As an example, let's take Javier Escuela. This guy becomes a major character in the second game, but in the first game, he's just thrown in on top of Bill Williamson. And that's sort of, well, backwards. You should have set up this guy way earlier. Show us who he is and why the government want to capture him. He's just thrown in. And the choice of either killing him or hog-tying him, he's gonna die either way anyways. So what exactly is the point? Since most of the missions require you to help people, I wish there was some way we could subvert the missions to assist the honor system, because you get a mission failed statement if you do something illegal like kill civilians. Now, all of my criticisms are negated come Red Dead Redemption 2, but I have to wonder why this game doesn't have that. Now, the game has grown on me in subsequent playthroughs, but I still felt like the story can feel like a chore at times because I failed to see how X mission was relevant to the overall story. I feel like Red Dead Redemption 2 is the opposite because every story mission feels important in some way, and there's a gradual process towards something. Stuff happens. Gang members might be killed off, or there's an important development going on, or whatever. In the first game, I always felt like a lot of missions were paper thin and had no point to them aside from do a chore for me and I'll help you get to Bill Williamson. So if I were to be constructive, what could they have changed? I'm thinking that there probably should have been more gang members to hunt down. Like maybe at least 5. And each of them has a personal connection to John. Like Bill Williamson is the guy he never got along with, and Dutch was the man who taught him shit. But also having more gang members to hunt down would probably make the structure more eventful, so they don't have to pad out the hunt for Bill Williamson. Also establish Javier Escuela in the story more, because I always felt there was something missing. It felt so awkward having 3 gang members to hunt over the stretch of 57 missions. That's questionable in the pacing of the whole thing. I think something about the first game is that the developers probably knew that the backstory to the game was more interesting than the game itself, hence why Red Dead Redemption 2 is a prequel. I played Red Dead Redemption before the second one came out, and I was shocked at how every major criticism I had with the first game disappeared with the second. A connected, intricate story with a clear direction and eventful as all hell. The honor system actually being there for something, choices in the same vein as GTA 4, etc. Also, the arc for Arthur Morgan is way more clear than John Marston, with Arthur Morgan actually having a clear redemption by the end that is earned. John Marston though, he does missions for the government to save his family, and sure, he does sacrifice himself to save his family in the end, but it's not much that's redemption-y. Like again, am I missing something? Now let me just get this out of the way. The game is good. The combat is pretty good. Deadeye was an excellent inherited feature from Red Dead Revolver, and the graphics are pretty good for the time. Plus, this game was the most expensive one to make at the time, so I'm confident that they worked hard on this title. Still, if we compare stories, it's no contest. The second game is the obvious winner. Compared to other open world games I've played, including those from Rockstar Games, the story has something about it that isn't very interesting. They rectified all the criticisms I had in the first game come the second, but still. When it comes to Red Dead Redemption, my least favorite major thing about it is the story. And given I hear a lot of people talk about the story like it's some brilliant tale, I have to respectfully disagree. Red Dead Redemption is far from a bad game, but the story left a lot to be desired. And thankfully the second game didn't have the same quote-unquote style of story. I wanted to suck this game off to the ends of the earth, but to be honest, I have my problems with that. And based on what I've played of Undead Nightmare, that game has the same awkward story structure. Although as an expansion, it kind of has an excuse to be less story focused. I like the fight against zombies after all, but that's a discussion for another time. I give Red Dead Redemption an 8 out of 10, although 7.5 would also be a score I would highly consider. With that being said, those are my problems with Red Dead Redemption. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?